Hi, my name is Vincent Lima. I use he, him pronouns. I organize with the amazing Rochester, New York chapter of DSA, which is quite well represented here today. I also chair the political committee of the Socialist Majority Caucus in the Democratic Socialists of America. This is the regular monthly meeting gathering of the National Caucus. We thought the topic would be of interest to everyone and benefit to non-members as well. So we have opened the meeting to all. If you're not a member of DSA, welcome. We urge you to join DSA, and I'm about to drop a join link in the chat, and join our collective work of building a humane and democratic alternative to capitalism. If you're not a member of Socialist Majority, again, welcome. We urge you to read our points of unity, which I'll also drop in the chat, or at least the link will. I'll drop a link in the chat. And join us. We work toward a majoritarian popular movement, rejecting feel-good posturing in favor of building power through mass work. We want socialists to lead a popular front against MAGA fascism, and we want you to join us. And if you are a member of SMC, welcome to our regular monthly gathering. Back in November, as we saw the election results, our comrade Jana made a remark that stuck with me. She noted that in Brazil, the left had overthrown the resurgent far right just 2 years earlier, and that in Colombia, where large numbers of trade unionists and other leftists were killed, the left eventually prevailed. Reflecting on this grim but hopeful remark, we thought we should look more deeply at this contemporary history. So with Jana and some help from Jeremy, we assembled this wonderful panel. So without further ado, I invite our SMC comrade Christian, who is co-chair for the Americas of the DSA International Committee, to introduce and facilitate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Christian from beautiful Long Island. Really glad you're all here today. Joining me today will be Marcus, Cruz, and Fanny to discuss their experiences from Brazil, Colombia, and France all together. We'll start, as I believe I'm waiting for, has Marcus joined us yet? Yes, he has. Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
We'll start with Marcus and Cruz on our first question here about Brazil and Colombia, which is how did the socialists and their allies
To overthrow their authoritarian leaders?
Well, I don't need to know all this.
Ok. Jana, me traduz?
You have to look for the globe on the bottom there, Marcos. While we do that, I'll bounce it on over to Cruz.
Okay. Yeah, so nice to be here, everyone. I'm Cruz Bonlarron Martinez. I work in a lot of different things, but I've done some reporting on Colombia, and I was also a Fulbright fellow in Colombia and had worked with the UN in Colombia. I was thinking a lot about this question. And really it's a matter of perspective and time. And just kind of thinking about how much time it takes to actually elect socialists and how that that like kind of dialectic between time and defeating the far right. There's so particularly thinking about the Colombian context, you have to think of it within a time period. One, you can think of it within a time period of 60, 70 years of armed conflict, but also within a very specific time period of a type of populist right that took power in the early 2000s with the election of Alvaro Uribe. And it was kind of similar to Trumpism in a lot of ways. Uribism came out of the elites looking for a new avenue, and also people feeling disillusioned with the previous two-party system in Colombia between the Liberal and Conservative Party, even though Uribe came from the Liberal Party, and kind of saw it as an idea as a way to get out of that dynamic of those two parties and very corrupt two parties, and looked to Uribe, who offered an alternative, semi-authoritarian alternative, very similar to what Trump offers, as far as that goes. And eventually, within 20 years of seeing what Uribism was, and the left kind of allying with the center at one point to defeat Uribism, with the center leading that fight at first, and then a return of the right again in 2018 with Duque's election, really kind of pushed things in a different direction. And there was a lot of there was protest initially before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic there was huge protests that really kind of catalyzed the left taking the leadership of the opposition to the right, and that's what pushed Petro to become president, and what allowed him to win the election. And then there's also a lot of contradictions when the left wins the election. And as far as with the case of Petro, there's definitely a lot of contradictions with the left having to make compromises, and also having to accept some people that we really don't like into our coalition. And but I think it's a very different place as when they're the people leading the coalition as to when we're the people leading the coalition. Yeah, so that's just a basic summary of how Petro came to win, and how socialism was able to eventually defeat the right in Colombia, but it was a long history. And later on with the other questions, I'm going to go into a bit more of that historical context. But I think it's key to recognize that the way that we relate to like these general movements in opposition to the far right, so these movements that are growing right now in opposition to Trump, the way that we relate to them and interact with them, even if the leadership of those movements at this moment is not politically aligned with us, I think it's important that we occupy those spaces, just like the Colombian left did previously. And then eventually, if there's the correct conditions, etc., and depending on the organizing capacity of the left, that we can then take over that role of opposition to the right. And it's a very different strategy. And so now, after the defeat of the right in Colombia, we're seeing that the discourse has completely changed, as opposed to a discourse similar to what exists within the Democratic Party now, as center-right discourse being predominant. We've seen the left become predominant in among youth, especially. So that's just an introduction to this long process, and it's just it can feel difficult when we're seeing all of this happen at once with Trump, but I think it's important to remember that it's a large historical process, and it's a historical process that can be, say, 20 years, but also thinking longer about 60 years, or even thinking longer about a century of of struggle against the right. So yeah.
Thank you, Cruz. So I'll ask our next guest, Fanny, with an insight from France in particular, the situation in France after the European elections and the dissolution of parliament, where it seemed that Marine Le Pen's party and the far right were ascendant and almost inevitable to their rise to power. But that did not happen, did it, Fanny?
Une demande. Oui, alors simplement pour expliquer, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
C'est bon? Ok. Simplement pour expliquer le contexte, on ne peut pas vraiment parler de victoire de la gauche, hein. C'est vraiment ce sur quoi je vais revenir en répondant aux différentes questions. Et d'ailleurs, il y a certaines questions auxquelles je ne vais pas pouvoir répondre. Je me présente rapidement. Donc moi, je suis militante féministe depuis longtemps. Par ailleurs, je suis impliquée dans la gauche écosocialiste qui intervient dans la France insoumise avec Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Et je suis aussi partie prenante de la Boétie, en fait, un institut qui s'est forgé autour de la France insoumise. Je m'arrête, Arthur.
Good evening, everyone. So, what Fanny is trying to say is that mainly what you said, your question is not correct regarding the last European elections. The left did not win those elections, and she presents herself as a feminist activist who's very close to Jean-Luc Mélenchon and the leftist movement of La France Insoumise. She's also ideologically eco-socialist, and she's also a member of the Boise Association, who's linked and next to the LFI left movement.
Oui, alors enfin, pour préciser par rapport à ce que tu disais, Arthur, en fait, la gauche a gagné, mais le gouvernement Macron a nié cette victoire. C'est ça qui s'est passé. C'était juste une petite précision importante.
So Fanny is saying that the left, even though they had the good score, because of the president and Macron's reaction to that score, it looked like they lost, but in fact, they made a very good score.
Mais simplement, donc, effectivement, pour revenir un peu sur le contexte, pour moi aussi, c'est important de revenir un peu sur le contexte d'ensemble. On est dans une situation politique générale où l'extrême droite monte en puissance depuis un certain nombre d'années, depuis plusieurs même décennies, on va dire. Et par ailleurs, ce qui est aussi favorisé d'une part par les politiques de gauche qui ont été menées successivement quand il y a eu des gouvernements de gauche, et d'autre part par les politiques qui sont menées actuellement par le gouvernement Macron, hein, qui est un gouvernement de droite, enfin, actuellement et puis depuis quelques années, qui vont dans le sens de la légitimation, en fait, hein, de cette extrême droite.
Okay, so Fanny is saying that it's very important to recall the context. It's been years and a long time now that the extreme right is gaining momentum and is gaining more popularity election after election. And one of like the main causes of this rise is the leftist policies who did not achieve, and Macron's policy, who's a very rightist policy. But yet again, he is legitimizing the fact that the extreme right has a political presence. Before it was considered taboo, and now it's very normal that the extreme right is just there and as a plausible option.
Dans le même temps, depuis 2018, avec le mouvement des Gilets jaunes, puis des mobilisations contre les réformes des retraites, puis encore une autre mobilisation contre les réformes des retraites de 2023, on a une situation sociale qui est marquée par beaucoup de luttes, de mouvements sociaux très important.
And meanwhile, with the Yellow Vests movement of France and the retirement age who was pushed even further, in France there are a lot of actions who demand and who are fighting for better social policies.
Mais ce qui se passe, c'est qu'il y a il y a un racisme et une islamophobie très puissante qui se développe donc dans la société, qui est de plus en plus autorisée, légitimée et qui ne se situe pas uniquement au niveau des discours, mais aussi au niveau quotidien, hein, avec des effets concrets sur les gens et des politiques qui sont menées, hein, par exemple, l'interdiction des abayas à la rentrée 2023. Et d'ailleurs, en ce moment, la discussion, c'est d'interdire complètement le foulard dans la rue.
Okay, so in France today, there's a very racist environment. There's a big Islamophobia. People are having or feeling this on their skin. It's not only politics, it's also politics, but not only politics. Usual things are getting done to people who are not involved in politics, and normal people are being driven by this Islamophobia and this racism. Today, one of the main subjects of the society and the political subjects are concerning whether or not women could have the hijab on them whenever they do sports or whenever they go to like the religious signs or allowed or not in public spaces, also schools for youngsters.
Et bien sûr, une offensive donc très forte sur les questions féministes et de genre, hein, qui se traduit par des discours médiatiques qui sont tenus et qui sont aussi autorisés, d'ailleurs, sur le modèle états-unien, parce que ce qui me semble important de souligner, c'est qu'il y a des modalités d'action de l'extrême droite qui sont directement reprises des mobilisations états-uniennes comme les groupes de parents contre le wokisme à l'école ou contre le prosélytisme trans ou contre la théorie du genre, etc., etc. Le développement d'un masculinisme aussi qui est très fort, qui du coup voilà, marque hein, monte en puissance depuis plusieurs années en fait hein, dans la société.
Again, there's a big offensive against feminism and against gender rights. The American model is being used by the French far right to applicate the same methods in France. They are using the same methods, like they are using parents are being gathered and they are protesting against wokeism in front of schools. And this has been going on and on. It's becoming more and more legitimate in the society. They are doing whatever they saw in the United States.
Et par rapport à ça, bien sûr, un autre élément déterminant de l'année dernière, ça a été le 7 octobre. Et l'impossibilité que nous avons aujourd'hui en France hein, à rendre compte de l'antisionisme, c'est-à-dire que quand on est de gauche notamment et quand on est de la France insoumise aujourd'hui et qu'on parle du sionisme, on est automatiquement accusé d'antisémitisme. Et donc, il y a eu, bon, je résume très vite, mais il y a eu beaucoup d'étapes. Et en ce moment, il y a encore une étape. Mais la situation est particulièrement difficile et ça produit aussi une division, en fait, de la gauche, cette question-là hein, de la Palestine.
So ever since the 7th of October, things have gone a little more complex. because the left mainly the La France Insoumise, the party of which Fanny is a member, have been in a very difficult posture, because whenever they talk about whatever is happening in Gaza, they are directly considered as anti-Semites and anti-Jewish people, but that's not what they are. They're just trying to point out things that are happening, and they deserve to be pointed out. And this is also creating issues inside the French left.
Donc, l'ensemble de ces éléments, en fait, permettent de comprendre la montée en puissance de l'extrême droite et la dissolution qu'a décidé donc Emmanuel Macron en juin dernier, suite aux élections européennes, hein, qui du coup a donné vainqueur, en fait, l'extrême droite en France.
All these elements contributed to the strength and the movement of the far right that we have. And unfortunately, with the dissolution last June of Macron, the left right has gained yet another momentum and has become stronger.
Peut-être que j'arrête là pour le moment, non? Et je dirai la suite après.
If you want, she can stop now, and she could continue later on, unless you want her to continue.
No, that's good for now. Thank you. So now we'll loop in Marcus. And also, as I'm curious about the situation in Brazil, is how much of the Brazilian far right is also trying to tap into the US playbook as part of its attempt to regain power, and how much of the far right, of the American far right's influencing the Brazilian far right, and how does that play into this longer battle for their attempts to reimpose authoritarianism in Brazil?
Boa tarde, companheiros e companheiros.
Good afternoon, comrades.
Eu me apresento primeiro, eu sou Marcos Sokol,
So I'm
membro
Marcos
da Comissão
Sokol,
Executiva Nacional do Partido dos Trabalhadores.
member of the National Executive Committee of the PT, Workers' Party
Sou
of Brazil.
economista de formação
I'm an economist
e militante socialista, para usar o termo
And,
da pergunta sugerida,
a socialist activist
desde a adolescência.
since I was a teenager.
Já faz algum
I
tempo.
have been an activist, which was a long time ago.
A questão
The question
de como a extrema-direita
on how
se
the far right
conecta
is connected
com os Estados Unidos, foi o que eu
With the-
entendi,
between the Brazil and the United States
tem a ver com as instituições do Estado brasileiro
which is connected to the Brazilian state institutions
subordinadas a século,
that have been subordinated in the last century,
pouco mais de século,
maybe more than a
à
century,
hegemonia dos Estados Unidos da América
To
no
the-
continente.
to the American
O Brasil
hegemony on
deixou
the
de ser
American
colônia de
continent,
Portugal
which is
para
a
passar
shift.
à esfera
Brazil was under Portuguese
influência da
influence,
Inglaterra,
and then it became under
e na virada
English,
do século XIX para o século
and
XX,
then from the 19th to the 20th
quando
century,
adveio a dita república,
when the
digo
Fifth
dita
Republic,
porque foi golpe militar.
yeah,
A minhas coisas se
there was a military
O golpe
coup.
militar que constituiu a dita república
The military
Foi
the military
progressivamente
coup
atraindo
created a republic
na esfera militar a
which
demais
within the,
comercial e diplomática
which
para os
strengthened
Estados Unidos da América. Isso
trade diplomatic ties with the United
se
States under the
cristaliza
military government.
na
This
Segunda Guerra Mundial.
crystallizes. This becomes even stronger
depois
during the Second
continua
World War II,
na escola
and
do
then
Panamá,
continues as
Temos sempre informação
Brazilians start participating in the School
militares
of the
da
Americas,
América Latina que vocês devem ter ouvido falar. A
which is
primeira
the place
Constituição
where the
brasileira
American Army trains
golpe da República.
Latin American military.
previa uma tutela militar.
So
E todas as
Brazil was living
constituições
under
desde
this
então, que são cinco,
military
tem lá um artigo
tutelage.
que consagra a tutela militar.
So
A ordem
within
interna é atribuída às Forças Armadas. pra vocês entenderem.
the Brazilian Constitution allows for this military
Então é a
tutelage, which
instância
gives
do
the
último
military
recurso. À
responsibility
medida que
for
ela se americanizou,
having
longo
the
do século
Brazilian
passado,
military is responsible for maintaining law and order. And this is
os
something that the
militares passaram a
Americans
depender
always
cada
kind
vez
of
mais
approved of.
da influência. O golpe de 64 foi ordenado na Casa Branca.
The Brazilian
gravações
military,
depois
the
mostram
coup
isso.
in 1964 was ordered from the White House.
A extrema-direita atual
The current far right in
é
Brazil,
herdeira de uma extrema-direita que sempre existiu no Brasil.
they are inheriting
Cresceu
the far right, which has
inflada
always
pelos
existed in
militares,
Brazil. And it's
porque as
grown thanks in
candidaturas
part to
da
the
direita
role of the
tradicional
military today.
não conseguiram mais derrotar o PT. Apesar
And
das
this,
fraudes,
the far right only
financiamento
became,
privado
only were able
vicioso,
to come into
representação
power in
que não é
2018
proporcional,
because
o voto
through
que
an
não é em
ordinary
lista, enfim, isso tudo é
political view,
antidemocrático.
ordinary politics, they
Mas
were not
o
able
PT
to beat the
ganhou.
Workers' Party.
5 das 6 eleições,
The
5 das
last,
7 eleições
the last,
presidenciais desde a chamada redemocratização, quando acabou o regime.
and the last 7
militar
elections
64.
after the redemocratization period,
Então eles partiram
the Workers' Party
para
has won
processo
5 of them.
de violação da regra, mantendo uma aparência
So
de violação da regra.
the far right
Lula
had
foi
to kind of
preso
change the
por
rules of the game in
determinação
order to win.
O comandante do exército à época.
Yeah, and even this with Lula
Supremo
being the
Tribunal Federal
the
estava dividido.
so-called commander of the army, at least in theory.
Aí ganhou a
When he
eleição
was-
Bolsonaro, senão o Lula teria ganho.
Yeah.
Mesmo depois da
You know,
Dilma
Lula was put into prison
capitulando,
unfairly, and
ter
if it
sido
wasn't for that,
vítima de
they
um
won the election over
ilegal,
Bolsonaro. There was the
ao fim do
illegal
mandato dela,
impeachment
foi substituída por um
against
vice de
Dilma.
direita.
She
Ao
was
fim do mandato
taken
dela,
from
Lula teria
office.
ganho a eleição. Não
Uh,
tivesse sido
and
prisioneiro.
then Lula again
Mesmo assim,
using because of lawfare, Lula was put in prison,
sendo
and if
um
it wasn't for
mandato
that, he
muito
would have
competitivo naquele
certainly
momento,
won the
E
election.
basta falar isso.
I think that's the main point for right now.
De onde vem essa força do PT?
Where does the
A força
force
da
of the
extrema-direita já
PT
disse.
come from?
O que tem de nacional
I was talking
é
about how
inflada pelas
where the
Forças
far right
Armadas com
gets its
apoio do
force from the
agronegócio.
military.
Para resumir,
And now they
além das
also very
igrejas
influenced by like
pentecostais,
agribusiness also
neopentecostais.
supports the far right.
A força do PT vem do fato de que,
The-
ao fim
the-
do
the-
regime militar,
The PT's
64,
force
né, nos
comes
anos
from
70,
the
80.
great sort of social movements coming out of
E
redemocratization,
conseguiram, a partir das
redemocratization in the
greves,
1980s. That came, you know, from the big, the major
ultrapassaram
strikes, the
os
general
partidos da
strikes,
esquerda tradicional.
and the strikes that were not, they were
particular, o
not
Partido
so big, they
Comunista
were not able to be controlled by the traditional
Sua
left-wing parties.
dissidência, o Partido Comunista do Brasil.
And so the
Quando houve
PT
uma
came
grande
out,
campanha por
was-
eleições diretas para presidente, porque não era,
the PT comes out of these organic
ao fim da
struggles.
campanha,
Then there's
a
a big
oposição
campaign in
burguesa
1984 for direct
foi
elections
participar
for
de
the first
dito colégio
presidency, for the first president
que é
after the military dictatorship.
coisa truncada e trocada.
It was that the
Instituída pelo
Brazilian
regime
people
militar para se
are not
preservar.
able to win these
O
electoral
MDB,
direct
mais uma vez,
elections.
foi
So
participar
it
do
was a
jogo
very kind of
Foi uma
truncated
traição ao movimento que pôs milhões
transition
nas
to
ruas
democracy.
por eleições diretas. E o PT disse que não ia ao colégio eleitoral, teve que expulsar 3 dos 8 parlamentares que ele tinha para manter a posição, e resultou que na eleição presidencial seguinte, o Lula foi para o segundo turno, mesmo se não ganhou a
Yeah.
eleição.
And so even though
falei
the
que
PT was kind
nacionalizou,
of a
nasceu
little
nas greves,
ambiguous about
cresceu pela
collaborating with the sort of center
e se
right for
nacionalizou
these
na campanha
direct
direta
elections and in the first
pelas eleições diretas para se
in the indirect
consolidar
election
na
that
primeira eleição
happened
presidencial que houve.
after the end of the dictatorship.
Então,
Being
eu
firm
acho
in
que
its
isso dá uma
positions,
ideia
the PT was
que a
able
direita
to
teve
go
muita
make it to
dificuldade
the second round of the first truly
quando a
free
candidatura do Lula
election
finalmente se
for
impôs.
president in
Foi a quarta vez que
1989.
ele disputou.
So Lula was only able to win finally the
2002.
president after he
E aí ela demorou um certo
ran 4
tempo.
times for president.
Para articular uma direita, fabricar uma base de massa. E devo dizer também que ela joga, né, essa extrema direita mais contemporânea, nesse movimento internacional.
And then obviously
onde
nowadays,
o grande
the
capital
new
utiliza a
far right
extrema
we're
direita
seeing,
e
which had
explora as
these earlier
vacilações e
links,
recursos
does
da
have
esquerda tradicional.
international links.
Então,
Uh,
muita
which
decepção, frustração que é carreada pela extrema direita. E o PT está no fio da navalha.
And so right now the PT is having a lot of, is in a big crossroads right now because it's confronting the far right. It's also, having to kind of reconcile with the center right as well in order to maintain itself in government. Says, should I stop here or?
Sure, that's good for now. Thank you. And now,
Question about the broad coalition in Colombia, and in particular as well, what were some of the trade-offs, negotiations, but also the principles that ultimately defined the construction of the pact?
Yeah, so as I stated earlier, yeah, that the formation of the victory of the Colombian left really took a long historical trajectory, and it really took off after the center was unable to really challenge the right, and in the 2018 elections, even the main candidate from the center decided to abstain from voting instead of voting for the left. He decided to abstain from voting, and that's why a lot of people saw as one of the reasons why Duque was able to win, and that Uribism was able to return to power. So I think that sent the left kind of soul searching, similar to the moment that we're in right now in the US. Yeah, it definitely sent the left thinking a lot about how to build coalitions, and particularly after the pandemic and the 2021 national strike, which was a huge set of protests that took over Colombia, and where 80 people were killed by state repression. So that that kind of those protests were born spontaneously. It wasn't something that came out of the left per se. It was very similar to the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd in the US. Very like spontaneous protests that kind of broke out, but without like one particular leadership. So one thing that the left did in that way was was support these protests without trying to take them over, and was really trying to support the protests and understand their demands, and bring those demands to Congress. So there were particularly two Congress people who on the left, Maria Jose Pizarro and Gustavo Bolivar, who might both be presidential candidates. They brought a lot of the demands of the social movements to Congress. And then the presidential election came around, and the left figured that it made a lot more sense to be united instead of running separately, which had been what happened traditionally. And the left got behind the candidacy of Gustavo Petro. And then it was an issue of building a broader coalition. It was an issue of building a broader coalition beyond the left and beyond the social movements that came out of the national strike. And that broader coalition came out really of it came out of just kind of meeting people where they're at, and presenting yourself as the most electable alternative in that case. So it was a very weird situation where for the first time there was no real successor to Duque picked. There were two candidates on the right, one of which got ended up getting eliminated in the second round, the one who was on the traditional right. And then another populist right-wing candidate came up in the second round. But the populist right-wing candidate didn't really have an ideology, didn't really even to the extent of an ideology that we're extremely opposed with. He didn't just have any plan. So it became an opportunity to present the left as the candidate of stability and the candidate of a stable coalition. And so a lot of that also meant making alliances with certain members of the elite and certain politicians who had been in previous governments, including the Uribe government, and getting them on the side, but also understanding that relationship, that you have to give them things to be able to get their support. But the fact that the left was the hegemonic player within that coalition made it very different than when the left when previously in the Santos government in the second term, where the left supported Santos in the second round, but didn't really have that hegemonic role. So it's a very different situation. And it's been somewhat uncomfortable for a lot of the Colombian left, I feel, because now they're allying with people who we know are corrupt, who we know have very serious problems, but who are able to at least negotiate with certain factions of the elite and are able to, and I think it really depends on, it gives the leftist space to show, look, we can't do this because we have this limitation. So it also gives the leftist space to move outside of that limitation. And that's what's happening now with the failure of getting reforms through Congress, that now they're being brought to a plebiscite. So.
Thank you, Cruz. And next, we'll talk to Fanny on the situation in France, in particular on how unstable the situation has gotten, and the role of the left in its current moment, as well as how it is building resistance to the far right, not just in places where it's traditionally understood to be strong, but in the countryside as well.
Ouais, donc avant de revenir sur l'instabilité actuelle, je vais revenir un peu sur le mois de juin de l'année dernière, c'est-à-dire à partir du moment où il y a eu la dissolution et qu'il y avait donc les élections qui devaient avoir lieu un mois après, donc début juillet. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en fait et comment est-ce qu'on a fait pour que finalement, effectivement, la gauche gagne à ce moment-là, donc le nouveau Front populaire. Je vais expliquer un petit peu ce qui s'est passé en fait pendant ce mois de juin de l'an dernier.
Before getting into the current unstable situation, we're going to talk about what happened in the dissolution of June and how by July the left had already formed a new front named the New Popular Front, and how we made a good score with this.
Alors, donc pour dire déjà, l'idée de Front populaire, hein, c'est la reprise d'une dynamique qu'il y avait eu en France dans les années 30, hein, contre le fascisme aussi, hein, donc qui faisait une alliance en fait de gauche, avec aussi d'ailleurs des organisations syndicales. Et c'est cette idée qui a été réactivé en quelques jours, mais vraiment en quelques jours. Finalement, au départ au sommet, mais du fait qu'il y ait une attente très importante dans la population, il y a un accord de répartition des circonscriptions qui a été trouvé entre les différentes forces de gauche, donc que ce soit la France Insoumise, le Parti communiste, le Parti socialiste ou bien Europe Écologie Les Verts.
So the idea of the new Popular Front is an idea who came back from the 1930s, where in France we had a similar situation, and we needed to gather all the left to stop the fascist movements. So in July, in a few days, this idea naturally came back up, and all the parties of the left got united, and electoral districts were handled and divided. Each one of the parties took one electoral district so that they do not fight each other.
Donc, ça, c'est au niveau des partis, mais il y a eu aussi tout un arc, en fait, qui comprenait le mouvement social et notamment, par exemple, aussi, les organisations syndicales comme la CGT, qui s'est du coup aussi impliquée, dans cette dynamique du nouveau Front populaire et c'est assez, comment dire? C'est pas nouveau, mais disons que c'est assez rare, que les organisations syndicales en France fassent des appels à voter, en fait, à une échelle, assez massive et mettent les militants et les militantes à la base en mouvement, sur une question électorale. Donc ça s'est passé donc par exemple, hein, la CGT, la dirigeante de la CGT, Sophie Binet, a fait des vidéos pour appeler en fait l'ensemble de son organisation à se mobiliser en faveur du nouveau Front populaire. Et c'est aussi important d'avoir ça en tête parce que dans la CGT, aujourd'hui, la situation est telle en France qu'on a des militants et des militantes de base, des syndicalistes, hein, qui peuvent très bien en fait se situer maintenant du côté de l'extrême droite. Donc il y a eu cette idée de vraiment mettre en mouvement à la fois des organisations politiques, le mouvement social, le mouvement féministe, par exemple, bien sûr, hein, a participé à des manifestations. Il y a eu une manifestation qui a été organisée à l'appel des organisations, notamment féministes, etc. Et le mouvement syndical.
What was very interesting about this movement is that the work unions and the main one who's called CGT, who gathers all the syndicals and the work unions of each and every work field, were also gathered and were also pushing their members to vote for this new Popular Front. The head of this work union, which is Sophie Binet, made a lot of calls to everyone who was in the syndicals, in these work unions, to vote for the new Popular Front. And what has to be said is also that in these unions, there are a lot of rightists, there are a lot of extreme right people, and they were all gathered behind the work union banner who was in favor of the Nouveau Front Populaire, of this new Popular Front. Feminist associations and a lot of not political groups were also gathered around this movement, and that's why this movement achieved.
Alors, il s'est passé beaucoup de choses, mais parmi dans cette mobilisation, en fait, il y avait un énorme enjeu à aller aider les circonscriptions dans lesquelles il y aurait probablement une victoire de l'extrême droite. Et donc d'aller aider les candidats et les candidates du nouveau Front populaire un peu partout sur le territoire et notamment dans les campagnes. Et donc, ce qui s'est passé, et ça c'est la première fois en fait hein, que quelque chose comme ça d'aussi fort se produit, c'est que différentes groupes, enfin différentes structures ont organisé des initiatives pour faire venir des gens, donc 20 personnes, 50 personnes, voire 100 personnes, pour aller faire du porte-à-porte dans les campagnes, ou bien pour aller distribuer des tracts devant les écoles dans des circonscriptions qui pouvaient être justement gagnables par l'extrême droite, donc contre l'extrême droite. Donc il y a eu des dispositifs, par exemple, il y en a un qui s'appelle les convois de la victoire, avec des personnes, des militants et des militantes qui ont centralisé les informations sur les circonscriptions qui étaient en difficulté et qui envoyaient des gens pour aller dans toutes ces campagnes. Et ce qui est important, c'est que à ce moment-là, plein de militants et de militantes, mais aussi surtout peut-être plein de personnes qui jusqu'à présent peut-être n'avaient jamais fait de politique, n'avaient jamais milité de cette manière-là en tout cas, ont dit bah moi je veux aller servir à quelque chose, je veux faire quelque chose contre l'extrême droite, et on leur disait bah tu vas partir en week-end à tel endroit de la France pour aller sur les marchés, pour aller faire du porte-à-porte et discuter avec les gens sur ce que ça représente comme risque en fait, la victoire de l'extrême droite.
So one of the other nice ideas of this new Popular Front was that they gathered every time little groups of 20, 30 to 50 people, and they went into the electoral districts where a victory of the far right was expected. They went there and they gave around brochures, political brochures. They went door to door. They were in the markets. They were in front of schools, exposing their ideology, exposing the risks of the victory of the far right. And even something interesting that happened, people who were never in the activist movements, they were coming and asking, how can I help? And they were distributed into districts in the villages, because that's mainly where the right has votes. And so they were like dispatched for a weekend to villages, and they were sent to do this political activist job, to go door to door, to hand out brochures, and to expose the risks of the victory of the right, of the far right.
Et il y avait du coup plusieurs niveaux d'enjeu. Il y avait l'idée de faire changer d'avis des gens qui avaient voté extrême droite auparavant. Et il y avait l'idée aussi, peut-être surtout, de faire voter des abstentionnistes, c'est-à-dire des personnes qui n'étaient pas allées voter, et de leur expliquer qu'il y avait un énorme enjeu à aller voter. Donc ça se joue aussi dans les quartiers populaires, par exemple, où il y a eu beaucoup de moments de porte-à-porte pour justement convaincre les gens d'aller voter, en leur disant que c'était vraiment important. Donc ça, c'était les personnes visées globalement. Et puis par ailleurs, il y avait évidemment sur le fond l'idée d'aller discuter et de montrer en fait les mensonges qui pouvaient être véhiculés par l'extrême droite, notamment le vernis social que peut se donner l'extrême droite, qui met en avant l'idée qu'il est du côté des classes populaires, alors que la politique qui est menée va totalement à leur encontre. Il y avait cette idée de justement montrer en fait que tout ça c'était des mensonges, et puis aussi justement bien sûr parler de la question du racisme et d'essayer d'expliquer en fait aux gens que c'était se tromper d'ennemis que de développer un discours raciste. Ce qui a fait que pour beaucoup d'entre nous, par exemple, quand on est des militants depuis très très longtemps, par exemple, c'est pas fréquent qu'on va discuter avec des gens qui votent d'extrême droite, mais on est allé les voir, en fait, y compris ceux qui votaient extrême droite, et qui disaient moi je soutiens Jordan Bardella. On a été obligé aussi de discuter avec des gens avec cette idée qu'il fallait qu'on les convainque de ne pas, voilà, qu'on essaye de donner des éléments en fait sur le discours qui est tenu.
So they were the new Popular Front was not only trying to change those who were voting for the extreme right, they were also trying to convince those who were abstentionists who were not voting at all to understand how much things were crucial and that their political duty should be done because things are very, very risky. The new Popular Front also exposed the social lies of the extreme right because they always act like they care about those who live in projects, those who are socially unsecure. So they went there and they talked. They went door to door again in those regions, and they talked about the racism of these people, and they also even met people who assumed that they vote for the extreme right, and they tried to argument and to convince them not to vote for Jordan Bardella or other predominant figures of the far right.
Et donc, bah, finalement, on a gagné. Et donc, ça a été une explosion de joie assez dingue parce que on s'y attendait pas du tout, en fait. On pensait, enfin, bon, voilà, on pensait pas qu'on gagnerait. Et donc, on a gagné. Et personne ne s'y attendait, même 2 minutes avant, en fait, personne ne s'y attendait à ce qu'on gagne. Et donc là, on était début juillet et il y avait du coup l'idée que la gauche propose une candidature pour devenir Premier ministre. En disant, dans la mesure où on a gagné, c'est normalement à nous hein, de devenir, c'est à nous d'être au gouvernement, en fait, d'organiser le gouvernement. Donc ça a mis le fait que la gauche, à ce moment-là, se mette d'accord sur cette candidate, ça a mis plusieurs semaines. Mais il y a une candidature qui a été trouvée, qui faisait consensus entre les différents partis de gauche. Donc Lucie Casté, mais en fait cette personne a été complètement ignorée par le gouvernement, enfin par Macron en fait, voilà. Et tout ça a duré très longtemps, c'est-à-dire que c'était du coup les vacances, le mois de juillet, le mois d'août. Il y a eu les Jeux Olympiques, voilà, effectivement, il fallait organiser les Jeux Olympiques. Et du coup, pendant des semaines, en fait, jusqu'à la rentrée du mois de septembre, il n'y avait pas de gouvernement légitime. Enfin bon, d'ailleurs, après, il n'était pas légitime non plus, mais je vais y revenir dans la troisième question. Mais le gouvernement était démissionnaire, en fait. Et la proposition que nous avons faite de Lucie Casté a finalement, du coup, pas du tout été retenue par Macron. Et je reviendrai dans la troisième question sur du coup l'instabilité actuelle depuis ce moment.
So no one was expecting, neither we were expecting that we could have had the score, but we won, and it was very unexpected. Then we decided, and we had a few weeks of consultations. Then we came on a consensus, and we had Lucie Casté as a consensual prime minister candidate for the new Popular Front. But unfortunately, she was ignored by the government, by Macron. And all this happened in July. And there were the Olympic Games taking place in France those days. So it was a very movemented period. Until September, there was no legitimate government. Fanny will talk later on about why the governments who came one after the other were all illegitimate. But on those days, what we can say is that Lucie Casté was never considered, or she was ignored by the Macron government.
Excellent. Thank you. And now we'll bring it to Marcos. So last time we checked with Brazil, this was the return to democracy. And we want to fast forward just until the all the way until the most recent presidential election. In particular, I want to start with the release of Lula from prison following the Lava Jato scandal and the lawfare that resulted in his imprisonment. And in particular, building that campaign that followed right afterwards and how it led to his reelection and ultimately the reaction of the far right that culminated in the January 8th riot in Brasilia.
Jana, você pode pedir para ele repetir? Pode ser em inglês mesmo.
Ele tá. Christian, can you repeat the question and maybe summarize it?
Sure. So basically, it's kind of similar to how the situation was in Colombia with that I asked Cruz, but basically from the Lula's return to power, we're going to start there and since his release from prison, in terms of building the coalition against Bolsonaro to return to the presidency to defeat Bolsonaro, but also how did it radicalize the far right and the Bolsonaristas into what we saw in Brasilia on January 8th of 2022.
Ok. Bom, eu me desculpo por pedir para repetir, porque aqui atrás está se realizando um encontro nacional no Diálogo Ancepetista, que é corrente do PT. Eu saí direto para chegar na hora.
So sorry I had to ask for you to repeat the question, but they're having he's at the office of his caucus of the PT and it's having a big meeting, and so there's a lot of talk in the background. So just to summarize, in 2016 through 2022, it was a period of resistance.
Dos socialistas e dos democratas.
But for people who are socialists, people who are social democrats,
na cultura,
people who were involved, cultural resistance, political resistance.
Desmantelaram
the two
estruturas da cultura brasileira.
The two far right governments that came to power basically dismantled support for culture and art.
Mudanças de sexo que estão sendo forçadas nas
escolas. They also were completely against rights for trans people.
Demonizaram as mulheres.
They demonized women.
Diminuíram os programas para quilombolas.
They marginalized and cut off from reduce the budget of programs to promote racial equality.
Depois veio as medidas de contra-reforma.
And after this, after these measures, they passed what we call the counter reforms, the counter reform in Social Security, the counter labor reform.
Em seguida, a da desmontagem da lei do trabalho, reforma trabalhista.
And this labor law reform, which really has negatively impacted the working class.
As suas garantias, direitos.
It's taken away a lot of the working class.
E a campanha Lula livre.
And the Free Lula campaign, which because he was in prison this whole time since 2018.
18 a 19, ano e meio que ele ficou preso.
Yeah, so he was in prison for a year and a half. So our Free Lula campaign was catalyzed. Catalyze the resistance in these dark times against the reforms, these counter reforms, and against all these sort of medieval type measures.
Ele enfrentou uma operação de Estado para se eleger.
And the PT, which was leading this campaign, had to, confront an entire state apparatus.
Uma força popular que impôs a candidatura dele com uma diferença pequena. Mas é preciso reconhecer que o Biden, em 11 meses,
so Lula, after coming out out
Enviou
of prison, you know,
6
was able to, riding on
figuras
the
do alto
wave
comando,
of popular pressure, was able to
Quarta
win the
Frota, Assessor de
presidency,
Segurança Nacional,
but by only a
diretor da
very small
CIA,
amount.
ministro da
It is
Defesa,
important to
Sérgio
make sure
Pacheco,
that, you know,
mandou mais para o
11 months
Brasil do que para
before the
Israel.
2022 elections, Biden did
Para
say,
quê?
come to
Para conter os
talk. He
golpistas.
did talk to Brazilian authorities and say
Ele não
that they
queria
would not
trumpista
support.
no governo do
They
Brasil, é
would,
compreensível.
Biden said he would not support a military coup in Brazil if Bolsonaro would have tried it.
Ora, setor não aceitou essa contenção. Então, houve uma
And so
conspiração
one group of
golpista
the
reconhecida
military, you know, were,
e alguns
didn't,
generais,
despite the fact that they
todos
did not
sabiam,
have U.S.
ninguém
support,
ensinava.
wanted to go for a
Inclusive,
coup
os americanos
anyway.
sabiam, os
You know,
russos viram.
high-level generals were
Mas
involved
ninguém
in this,
ensinava.
you know.
E alguns foram para além do limite do consenso militar naquele momento.
And then, but
Porque
this
senão era
small,
banho de sangue.
smaller
Sabemos disso.
radicalized group that wanted to do a coup
Os
at all
americanos
costs
não iam
was
apoiar.
went
Como é que eles
against
não
not
foram
only the
balancear?
Americans, but also the majority of the armed
Mas teve
forces
grupo
who
que
were
foi até
more
o fim,
reasonable,
que
you know,
foi o
wanted
que
to
fez
stay within
aquele
the democracy.
tentativa de golpe de tipo fascista
And then they did not want to go
em
along
8
with a
de
coup
janeiro
attempt. They
de
were not
2023,
necessarily
uma
wanting
semana
to,
depois
you
da
know,
posse.
create a neo-fascist regime.
O problema é que o governo que assumiu, 23, 24, recuperou
The problem is that so that
sociais,
Lula's
das
new
estruturas
government, which came
culturais,
to power in 2023,
do
was
olhar
able
para
to
o
bring back some of the
LGBT,
social
para as mulheres, para os
programs
negros,
that he had
para a
implemented in his
juventude.
first
É
government,
verdade.
you know, obviously
Mas não fez nenhuma reforma
reaffirmed,
estrutural.
you know, reaffirmed
seja,
the rights of
Voltou à
LGBTQ
situação
people and
de antes do
women.
golpe.
So basically, it's the new Lula
E há uma
government
larga
basically
insatisfação.
trying to kind of
Mesmo se o governo Lula é o
rewind
melhor
Brazilian
governo que ele
politics
teve na
back to what
história,
it was
antes,
before the 2016 coup.
ele tem muito longe de satisfazer as aspirações.
Yeah, but
Por
unfortunately,
isso que a
because
extrema-direita
the
conseguiu,
best that Lula's
fabricando o
able
Bolsonaro,
to do
ocupar o
right now
espaço.
is
Então havia
basically just
frustração e há
return to what it
frustração
was,
novamente.
but he's not able to, you know, fulfill the
Não tem
hopes and
Biden
dreams,
mais
the
para desencorajar
aspirations
os
of people for
militares.
him to go further
Agora é o
what he
Trump.
did in previous
E
governments.
encoraja a família Bolsonaro.
And then obviously now we're in a
Nós
new,
vamos precisar de
even
mais
more
ajuda de vocês,
difficult
porque nós seremos outra vez.
scenario right now because Trump is
Pensando na
directly,
eleição
you know,
próxima de 2026 para
promoting
presidente.
the actions of the far right here in Brazil.
E a popularidade do presidente Lula não está boa. Está caindo.
And Lula right now is not does not have
propaganda do
high
governo
levels of
oficial é
popularity.
que o
in
PIB
the
está
opinion
crescendo, o
polls.
nível de emprego, mais ou menos como o Biden.
And it's
Depois
contradictory
a
because
Câmara
we have low
fizeram.
unemployment, you know, people's
não
incomes are
cola.
rising, yet
cola.
this is not kind of
No
hitting
caso
home within
agora,
the working class. You
você
know, it's kind
tem
of similar to what
crescimento do
happened with
PIB só à
Biden.
base da reforma trabalhista.
You know,
Então as condições de trabalho, trabalho
so
intermitente,
when you
trabalho
have
com
these
péssimo,
bad anti-worker labor law reforms,
Estão,
the P actually went down, you know, but now
infernizando a
that,
vida
you
dos
know,
trabalhadores. E houve uma explosão no
Lula's
final
trying
do
to
ano
create better
passado, vai recomeçar
jobs,
agora que acabou o
the
verão,
GDP is going up, but
fora das centrais
public
sindicais,
perception has
fora
not
das
changed.
centrais sindicais, de uma juventude que trabalha numa escala 6 por 1.
And so
Ou
you
seja,
have also,
trabalha 6
again,
dias e folga 1.
now there's a lot of precarious work in
Mas não
Brazil
é
because
domingo
of this
necessariamente.
anti-worker labor law
Então não
reform.
tem
So
mais
a
vida
lot
em
of
família,
young workers in particular
não
are
tem
no longer
possibilidade
represented by
cultural,
unions,
amizade,
don't feel a
não dá nem
connection,
para
don't feel
namorar.
represented by the major
E é
labor
para os jovens
confederations.
a área de serviços.
And they're working
E esse
very
setor explodiu,
long
exigindo o fim da escala
hours.
6 por 1.
There's a particular
Aliás, uma deputada do PSOL
there's
que
a
apresentou o
particular
projeto.
kind of work week
Porque o
called
PT
the
está
6 for 1.
acomodado
So
com
people
greve
work 6
sindicalismo
days and have only 1 day off a week.
bastante
And it's
burocratizado
very,
mesmo,
you know, it's
bastante
a lot of
burocratizado.
exploitation, you know, and mostly the
A
people
CUT
who work
segue
the
sendo a
6
principal central,
6 for
é a
1
única que você
work
pode
week
fazer
are
debate
mostly
político,
young workers,
na
you know,
verdade,
who are very
mas ela
low
está
paid
muito,
and
muito
they
acomodada,
feel very
burocratizada em
disconnected that the
relação ao que ela já
PT
foi.
and the unions are not taking on the struggle
Então o
against the
governo
6
tem,
for
na
6 for
opinião,
1 work week.
o governo tem que girar à esquerda.
So we
Se ele
believe that
quiser
the
ganhar em
government has
26,
to. So we believe that for
ele
the
vai girar à
Lula
esquerda.
government to win re-election in
Nós
2026,
temos
it
um problema
needs to
sério,
shift
que é
to
a
the left.
coalizão.
But
O
the
governo
problem is
fez,
that it's Lula's in
Lula fez nesse
coalition
governo
with
uma coalizão maior do que ele já tinha
center-right
antes, ao
partners.
centro e à direita.
So he again
Sem os
with
bolsonaristas.
politicians and parties from the
Mas
center and also
sem
politicians
uma
and parties
parte
from
da
the right.
direita, mas
It's
com
a- it's a
uma
broad-
parte da direita que no Brasil
It's a
sempre
broader
existe mais
coalition than he had
propriamente dito.
earlier.
Esta semana que nós estamos falando,
So
eu
this
falo
week,
hoje com um ponto de satisfação que eu não teria
yeah,
sábado passado.
Yeah, so
Essa
that
semana,
I'm
finalmente, na
particularly,
terça-feira,
I'm
o
particularly
ministro
upset
Haddad
by something
apresentou, ministro da Fazenda, né?
that I'm
Apresentou
particularly
uma
upset that
elevação
the finance
da faixa
minister
mínima do
present,
imposto de renda
so that
para 5.000
on
reais,
Tuesday, the finance minister
que
raised,
era uma
you
promessa
know,
de campanha.
tax exemptions for people,
Não é uma
you
reforma
know, who
estrutural,
earn basically
porque
people
não tem
who
faixa
earn
superior
less than
alta.
3 minimum
Sobe
wages
a base,
do not need to pay income
que era
tax, so which is
2.000
a positive
reais,
thing.
vai
It
para
used to only
5.000
be used to only
reais.
be people who earn
10
one
milhões de
minimum
brasileiros
wage
serão
would not have
beneficiados,
to be
mas
exempt
só
from
10
paying
milhões.
tax. So
Todos os salários
So that
são
was a
110
positive thing.
milhões.
Yeah. But
Então,
the problem is that he also promised to tax the rich more,
não
and,
sei se o
the
Congresso vai
amount
aprovar,
the
porque vai
amount
ser
that he
dominado
increased the taxes for the rich was very,
pela
very small.
direita, pelo centro.
But we understand that
Mas
again,
quem
there's not
sabe
much
a
they can
reação
do
à
because of
direita
this pressure from the right and from the center.
provoque Ei, eu estou ouvindo? Provoque uma mancha de óleo. Vocês entendem o que eu quero dizer? Um estranhamento. Mas eu não tenho nenhuma certeza disso. E nesse ponto eu não sou otimista. Por causa das alianças, que a política continua
So
sendo
we
de
hope
ampliar
that
ainda
maybe
mais
like, you know, if
as
we can
alianças.
mobilize, there'll be sort of
Eu
like,
termino com
you
uma
know,
coisa que comecei a
this
repetir,
will, you know, kind of
que é o
make the
axioma de Einstein.
scenario a little bit easier for
Mas é
move
conhecido
to
como
the left.
axioma de Einstein. Não sei se
Yeah.
companheiras e companheiros que estão me ouvindo conhecem o axioma de Einstein. O axioma de Einstein
So I want to talk about
consiste,
the Einstein's
na
axiom.
opinião do Einstein, em que
É.
a insanidade
Mm.
é fazer sempre a mesma
And so
coisa,
the axiom of Einstein is to say if you doing the
esperando
same
outro
thing,
resultado.
doing the same thing several times and expecting a different outcome.
Então, não fosse a intenção do Einstein, mas eu termino com o humor brasileiro.
So I think there's a lot we can apply to this
Ameaça
axiom in the current
realizar o
Brazilian
axioma
situation.
de
Yeah.
Einstein.
So we really don't want
Ah.
this, you know, we see the PT, or at least the majority of the PT kind of, you know, falling into this Einstein's axiom trap.
Thank
John?
you. So this will be the last round of questions. If you have questions, you can start preparing them and placing them into chat. And these last ones are going to be from me all around a central theme involving both the left, but also the impotency of the center and the inviability of it at this moment. So we'll start with Cruz, in particular on this, on the interplay within Petro's coalition during his presidency and the resulting left unification that has come from it, and how is it approaching the near and medium-term challenges ahead?
Yeah, so with Petro's presidency, it's the first time in modern history that there's been a left leader in Colombia, a president. So it's definitely been a balancing act because within the coalition you have some who are on outside of El Pacto who are on the center right. And then you have on the leftist part of the coalition. I mean, well, it depends how you would define it, but you have the former FARC. So it's a very broad coalition. And then within that coalition now has been the consolidation of the Pacto Histórico, which was initially a coalition of just leftist, most leftists from center left to the left parties, and then that coalition is kind of unifying into like one political party, which has been quite helpful because it means that certain parties won't be running against each other in local elections, etc., and that it just allows for better unity, and it allows for more democratic processes. With that being said, since being in government, Petro has had to kind of accommodate different sectors, like within the left, but then also outside the left in the government. So there have been major changes, and as far as discourse goes, there's definitely a lot of changes. But in Congress, it has been quite difficult to push through substantial reforms. However, what has been able to be done through the executive has happened. And looking forward to the next election, there's not really, in Colombia, you cannot run 2 terms anymore. There's not really a successor coming for Petro. So it really is up to the left to decide who will come next and how that candidate will look. So the unifying of the Pacto Histórico has kind of allowed the left to go to these next elections as one unified grouping. But with that being said, it's definitely a hard situation now. But I think there's been a lot of popular mobilization to support the government. The government has called for marches in support of different social policies. And that's been helpful to get people mobilized outside of like the electoral arena. But coming forward, as far as the elections are, elections will be next year. There's no real favorite, like, anyways, with it both within the left, but then also just generally, it can really be anyone who wins this election. So that means the far right has an opportunity now to go back to power. But it's a far right that's definitely been changed a lot, because this experience has really led to the fall of Uribism and the fall of Uribe as like a centralized figure on the right. So now the right in Colombia is a lot more inspired by, say, Milei in Argentina, or Bukele in El Salvador, more of this type of new regional or global far right that we're seeing, that's not really like in a national sense. So the left definitely has like an uphill battle for this election, but I think it's shown that it can govern, and that it's even able to make coalitions outside of itself. So looking forward to the next elections, I think the left has a record to show, and it can show that even if we haven't accomplished everything that we set out to accomplish, here's what we have accomplished. People have seen a substantial rise in the standard of living, especially under the most poor sectors of the population. There's been a huge decline in poverty since Petro took office. So yeah, it's definitely an optimistic situation, but again, there's always just that factor of not knowing what will be next, and without clear leadership, it's possible that the right could win these next elections.
Thank you, Cruz. And now to Fanny. We mentioned the illegitimacy of Macron's maneuvers and the overall weakness of his government now since last summer, and the debacles that resulted from the previous parliamentary election that he called. What does his weakness and the center's weakness present in terms of an opportunity and a challenge for the left in the near future?
Yes, non. Ok.
Oui, non.
Alors, donc pour continuer par rapport à ce que je disais tout à l'heure, effectivement, du coup, donc ce qui s'est passé en juin dernier, et puis par ailleurs, je vais y revenir, mais les mobilisations sociales que j'évoquais précédemment, notamment sur les questions autour des retraites, ça produit en fait une grande instabilité gouvernementale. Donc, peu de temps après cet été, donc Macron a composé un gouvernement avec des gens de droite finalement très durs et très réactionnaires, relativement proches de l'extrême droite, hein, par exemple, des gens qui sont contre le droit à l'avortement. Donc ça, c'était un premier gouvernement hein, qui a été proposé en septembre. Je vais m'arrêter là pour...
As we said before, what happened last June, the snap elections, and the fact that Macron has been continuously neglecting the NFP and the social movements regarding the push of the retirement age even further made the situation where Macron came again and made the government with rightists, and among those ministers were people who were even affiliated with the extreme right and people who were against the abortion right.
Donc, ce gouvernement, il a proposé un budget qui, en fait, a été censuré par le Parlement. Donc, c'était en novembre ou en décembre. Donc, 2 mois après, en fait, ce gouvernement, il est arrivé fin septembre, il a tenu 2 mois et la proposition de budget a été donc censurée au niveau parlementaire, hein, parce que du coup, il y a beaucoup de députés du nouveau Front populaire.
So the government who came in late September did not get the approbation of the parliament on his budget policy. So the budget proposition of the government was rejected, and this government was alive and was kept only for 2 months because there were a lot of new Popular Front deputies in the assembly, in the parliament, and they all rejected this budget proposal of the government.
Et alors, ce qui est important pour nous, la gauche aussi, et des choses qu'on se dit aussi nous, pour montrer à quel point en fait on pèse hein, au-delà du NFP, au-delà du nouveau Front populaire, c'est que du coup la discussion sur le nouveau gouvernement, donc il y a eu une absence de budget, pas de budget pour l'année 2025 pour tout l'État français, et donc voilà, la situation était bloquée et la discussion, elle a tourné autour de l'âge du départ à la retraite qui devait pouvoir être renégociable. Donc ça, c'était la mobilisation très puissante que nous avions connue en 2023, donc avec un arc unitaire syndical très fort, des millions de personnes dans la rue, une grève, etc. On n'avait pas gagné en 2023. Et pour autant, on s'est rendu compte, enfin on le sait évidemment, mais la discussion du mois de décembre sur la composition du nouveau gouvernement, elle était autour de cette question de l'âge de départ à la retraite, c'est-à-dire est-ce que ce nouveau Premier ministre que Macron allait proposer, il était d'accord ou pas pour revenir sur l'âge de départ à la retraite, ce qui était quelque chose de déterminant pour que la gauche ne vote pas la censure une nouvelle fois. Je ne sais pas si c'est très clair en fait. C'est peut-être un peu compliqué, mais c'est-à-dire que la pression du NFP est telle que ils sont obligés en fait enfin ils étaient obligés ils voulaient pas prendre de Premier ministre du NFP, mais ils ont bien vu que ça pouvait pas marcher avec des gens proches de l'extrême droite, donc ils ont composé un nouveau gouvernement en se disant si on accepte de revenir sur l'âge de départ à la retraite, peut-être qu'une partie de la gauche, alors pas la France insoumise, hein, mais par exemple le Parti socialiste, peut-être que le Parti socialiste sera d'accord pour nous laisser proposer un budget. Et c'est ce qui s'est passé. Après, je vais continuer, mais voilà, je vais m'arrêter là.
Okay, so the NFP is till this day so heavy and so strong in the parliament that thanks to the NFP, they achieved in blocking the 2025 budget. So for the 2025, the French state did not have an accepted budget accepted by the parliament. So what the NFP achieved in doing is reminding each and every candidate or the Macron government or Macron as a president that it's a central issue for them to renegotiate the retirement age. In 2023, there were big protests in France regarding this issue that did not achieve in getting some change. But now in this new composition of the parliament, since the NFP is very, very strong, they are becoming able to impose this subject and to bring it out on the table again. So they are becoming determinant on whichever candidate passes or not. So they are keeping up the pressure on the government and on the candidates who are proposed by the presidency to always see if they negotiate or not, renegotiate or not this retirement age. And if they assign someone who is ready to negotiate on this age, on this retirement age coming forward, maybe the socialists, for instance, would vote for him and he would have majority in the parliament. The LFI, of which Fanny is a member, the La France Insoumise, would maybe not vote it, but maybe most probably the socialists would go with that wave and would accredit the candidate with the votes that he needs.
Et donc, là, actuellement, le nouveau gouvernement est très fragilisé. Il vient de dire cette semaine qu'il ne reviendrait pas sur l'âge de la retraite. Donc, le PS va probablement voter la censure la prochaine fois. Donc, il est très possible qu'il y ait une nouvelle dissolution, même si ça ne peut pas être avant le mois de juillet prochain. Donc, on est dans une situation très instable et le nouveau gouvernement est du coup très affaibli. En plus, il y a d'autres histoires, bref. Et donc, c'est difficile de prévoir l'avenir, simplement pour dire que la situation économique, avec cette histoire de budget, mais pas que, eh ben, elle est très difficile en fait, hein. Il y a eu beaucoup de licenciements à l'automne. Il y a dans les universités, par exemple, il y a une baisse drastique des budgets. Dans la culture, cette semaine, il y a eu une mobilisation importante parce que pour la première fois, il n'y a plus du tout d'argent sur certains territoires pour mettre en œuvre des initiatives culturelles. Donc, on est dans une situation économique qui est particulièrement difficile. Et donc, voilà, avec des contestations, des mobilisations aussi hein, qui sont importantes. Voilà, et cette instabilité gouvernementale. Et on a eu aujourd'hui une manifestation contre le racisme unitaire qui était très importante dans différentes villes. Donc, c'est difficile de prévoir. Simplement, la gauche, et je vais y revenir après, la gauche est de nouveau très divisée. Et donc, ça n'aide pas à définir finalement aussi une perspective qui soit reprise par les gens.
So a few days ago, the current French government, Prime Minister said again that he would not renegotiate the age of retirement. So most probably the socialists will this time try to censure and to take away the trust of this government, and it will most probably create other instabilities. But there could be no dissolutions until July. But the economic situation is so unstable and so unclear that universities and other public sectors, cultural sector and other sectors are suffering from the absence of a budget. So it's a very, very unstable situation. Even in universities, we have this issue is being a big problem for all the students and the system. But for instance, today there were very, very big protests against racism all across France. But unfortunately, we are seeing that the left is getting divided again, and there are subjects on which they do not have a unified proposal, a unified vision towards the future, and that is very difficult to explain and to give a unified vision of the future to the population.
Sur le fond, l'idée, c'est pas l'unité pour l'unité, mais c'est sur quelle base. La grande discussion qu'il y a donc pour la gauche aujourd'hui, c'est est-ce que on revient à des politiques de gauche qui n'en sont pas vraiment et qui accompagnent le néolibéralisme, comme il y a eu au début des années 2000, dans les années 2010, et qui du coup ont conduit d'ailleurs l'extrême droite à sa puissance actuelle, ou est-ce que justement la France insoumise, par exemple, a permis de faire que un pôle massif se constituait globalement dans l'anti-néolibéralisme, en fait, hein, dans une forme même d'anticapitalisme. Et du coup, est-ce que c'est autour de ça qu'on doit graviter? Ou est-ce que c'est d'en revenir globalement à des politiques d'accompagnement hein, du néolibéralisme? C'est un peu ça, la discussion qu'il peut y avoir dans le NFP. Ça a réussi à faire quand même qu'il y ait des alliances sur des bases assez claires en juin dernier, puisqu'à ce moment-là, par exemple, le PS était parti vers la gauche, globalement. Vers l'anticapitalisme, l'antinéolibéralisme. Mais en fait, le PS, il y a des débats à l'intérieur du PS qui fait qu'il y a aussi une volonté de se rapprocher finalement de Macron et de remettre en place des politiques sociales libérales, enfin qui ne sont pas du tout sociales, du coup des politiques néolibérales à la sauce gauche. Donc le débat sur le fond, il est là, sur la question de l'unité. Finalement, c'est quoi la base de l'unité? Est-ce que c'est justement voilà, renforcer ce pôle-là dans une approche unitaire qui du coup entraîne à la fois les mouvements sociaux, les organisations syndicales, comme le NFP l'a fait hein, en juin dernier, ou est-ce que c'est justement rompre avec ça? Et donc là, on va voir, hein, moi je ne sais pas ce qui va se passer. Ce qui est certain aujourd'hui, c'est que c'est très tendu et il ne faut pas oublier tout ce que j'ai dit dans la première question, c'est-à-dire comment toutes les attaques comment il y a tout un tas d'attaques médiatiques lancées notamment par l'extrême droite, la Macronie, etc., contre la France insoumise, qui évidemment pèse aussi après dans les débats à gauche.
Voilà. As we said at the end, there are issues, and the left is pretty divided on many issues. But the main question is, it's not like they just want to act unified and just we're united and just act as they're unified. The main issue is regarding either to go back to neoliberal policies who have been conducted in the past by socialists, even though they act like it's very social, but in fact it's pretty neoliberal, or we go back, we go to really anti-liberal, anti-capitalist policies, which is proposed by Fani's movement, the LFI. And unfortunately, the policies, the neoliberal policies who were conducted by leftists in the 2010, 2013 period also led to the right to get some more momentum. And today, the Socialist Party is pretty much divided on whether they go closer to Macron or they go closer to the left LFI, again, Fani's movement. So it's a very unstable and unsure situation. No one knows what's going to happen in the near future. And since there is a big media attack on the LFI, as we said, we talked about the 7th of October and other issues, there is a big media attack on the LFE, and this media attack on the LFE is making LFE very difficult to have inner cohesion inside the left, including the PS, because the PS, the Socialist Party today, is getting further from the LFE and getting closer to Macron.
C'est tout là, c'est bon, je crois. J'ai résumé à peu près, je crois.
Merci beaucoup.
Yes.
So last one, real quick, thank you all for your contributions as well. This last one will be for Marcus, and again, much on the current moment here, but what are the areas in Brazilian society, economic, cultural, political, where this left wing of PT needs to grow in and convince in order to avoid the party's fall into, as he put it, Einstein's axiom?
É uma boa pergunta.
So good question.
Uma coisa que o governo poderia fazer
One thing the government
é
could
em relação
do,
a Gaza.
it would be related to Gaza and
Porque-
Palestine.
Mesmo a mídia,
Even
e
the
aí
media,
geral,
in
Procionista.
general,
está tendo mais dificuldade hoje que há 1 ano e meio atrás para
É,
defender
the-
o Netanyahu. E há um desgaste
the,
na opinião
the,
pública.
the media and the right
governo
wing
brasileiro,
are
Lula,
having
chamou
a
de
harder
volta o
time
embaixador.
now in compared to a year and a half ago to
Mas parou
defend
aí.
Netanyahu.
E o exército e as polícias
É.
militares continuam comprando armas. de Israel.
Lula, you know, made some
Você
statements,
sabe, o nosso problema aqui não é mandar
you
armas
know,
para
in
Israel.
solidarity with
Nosso
Palestine,
problema
but
aqui é
has kind
financiar a
of
indústria
left it
militar
there.
israelense comprando armas deles.
Yeah, and Brazil, for
A
example, has
Petrobras
not stopped
continua
buying
entregando petróleo
weapons from Israeli
Israel.
weapons manufacturers.
E medidas nessa área, tem uma
So,
comunidade
we can-
árabe muito grande no Brasil.
So that we have a very large Arab
Essas
population
medidas,
in
animais da
Brazil,
comunidade árabe,
you know,
essas
taking a
medidas eu acho que
stronger
teriam
stand
simpatia
would be popular with
depois de
them,
1 ano e meio de guerra. Mas em
especially
relação
after a year and a
à tua
half of
pergunta,
war.
a
But
verdadeira
regarding the
resposta
question,
é que
the real,
antes de
the real
crescer
answer
para outros
that-
setores, ele teria que
before
reconquistar a sua
growing,
própria base.
before growing
Em novembro,
to
dezembro, houve
appeal to other
novo
sectors,
ajuste fiscal.
we have to
O governo
return to appeal again to the working class.
Recuou
For example, we had a fiscal
parcialmente
reform,
da lei que o próprio
which-
Lula tinha estabelecido em 2023, que é uma lei de valorização do salário mínimo.
so one thing that it
Houve uma
did, it was,
desaceleração da
continues
valorização do
the,
salário
Lula,
mínimo.
for example, has continued
governo
to increase
restringiu
the real value of the work, of
tipo de ajuda
the
social
minimum
chamado
wage,
benefício de prestação continuada, BPC.
but at the same time,
Que atinge
is
principalmente
also
idosos,
with this new
mas
fiscal
também
policy is
deficientes,
reducing
desválidos, pessoas com
other
deficiência.
social benefits, like welfare benefits,
Ele
for people
restringiu.
who are
E uma coisa
disabled and
cruel,
unable to
ele
work.
diminuiu o abono
that's-
salarial, que é
And
um pagamento
he,
anual para uma faixa bem baixa.
Lula
renda.
also restricted
Então, na
something
verdade,
called
aquela
the
medida
bono
positiva, que
salarial,
eu-
which is like an
é
extra
positiva,
payment that people who are
de
very low
aumentar a
income
faixa mínima de
receive.
imposto de renda,
Uh,
ela pega os trabalhadores qualificados e o setor
So,
da classe média. Não pega a gente dizer que o povão.
doing kind of like
E essa
this
base mais popular, ele
politics
precisa
around
reconquistar.
tax policy, so making more formal sector workers exempt from
Ou
paying income tax is
Uma
really
forma
more
importante,
helping
se não
sort
revogar,
of not the
revisar
poorest
o que tinha
workers,
prometido,
but workers who have some kind of level of
as
income.
reformas do
You
golpe de
know, and they're
Estado.
not the
Temer
people who are the
Bolsonaro.
poorest are the ones who are the more naturally
A
the
reforma da
base of
Previdência.
the Workers' Party.
Essa que os franceses, de alguma maneira, similarmente, resistem. A reforma trabalhista, em vários
So
países do
again,
mundo,
we need to
esse processo de
we need to
desregulamentação.
undo this
E eu não
anti-worker
falei
labor
a lei
law
de
reform.
terceirização,
We also need to
E limitar.
undo a law that expanded
que cria
outsourcing,
clima nas
labor
empresas,
outsourcing.
que se tem emprego, é um emprego de péssima qualidade.
And
As
the,
pessoas são
the companies
agastadas.
obviously don't want to undo this law because it benefits them. And they
E
say, oh,
finalmente
it's
você tem aquela
creating jobs,
base
but the
militar do
quality of jobs that it's creating are very
que
bad.
essa não tem como ampliar.
And
Essa
then
você
we
tem
also
que
need to reduce military
restringi-la.
spending. Like we need to get rid
alternativa à
of, you know, I
Constituição
mean, the Brazilian
deveria ser
military needs
revisto.
a fraction of what it is, right?
Não é fácil, mas no mínimo o
But
governo poderia colocar em questão.
we know it's not easy,
Para não ser muito
but
sonhador, só pouco,
but you know, I know I'm a bit of a dreamer, or at least a
Lopes
little bit,
Obrador
but the
apresentou uma
government
série de
needs to
reformas
kind of put the military in check.
e foram bloqueadas no Congresso.
Yeah.
E uma que ele
I mean,
conseguiu aprovar,
So we know
Foi a
AMLO,
reforma,
for example, put a lot of
do
reforms
judiciário.
to Congress.
Foi
He
bloqueada
wasn't
no
able
judiciário.
to. He wasn't able to pass all of them, but it was
Chegou na eleição
inspirational
presidencial, ele
how he kind of
apresentou
was.
uma candidata,
You know,
retomou
he gave it a
suas
try. You
medidas.
know, he did
Ela foi eleita com 5 milhões de
a
votos a
legal
mais,
reform,
sem
a
se aliar com o
judiciary
centro.
sector reform
Aliás, o
that
centro e a
obviously
direita se
the
aliaram contra
judiciary
ele,
didn't accept,
contra a candidata dele, a Cláudia Sheinbaum.
but he kept going.
E ainda teve o tempo no seu mandato de fazer
And now we
aprovar
have
a
a-
eleição dos juízes. São 70 mil, 7 mil, já não me lembro, juízes que vão ser eleitos. Então,
So now
medida
that he was able to
democracia
push
até
through the
revolucionária, vamos
judiciary
dizer assim.
reform, you know, there's gonna be 9,000
Depois de várias
elected
tentativas que o povo
judges
se
now.
conscientizou onde estava
Yeah.
o obstáculo.
And so he's able to
É.
get rid of this obstacle, this political obstacle,
Poderia
through
fazer. Depois tem a
pushing
questão,
through this
alguém
judiciary
mencionou,
reform.
das taxações. O Brasil é o segundo
É.
fornecedor de
So-
aço dos Estados Unidos.
So another
Primeiro
thing that we're
Brasil.
worried about is the issue of the tariffs, right? Brazil is the number 2
O Trump anunciou uma taxa sobre taxa de
exporter
25%.
of steel to the United
Vai
States.
ser
And that's going to
em algumas
really
regiões do
hurt
país,
certain parts of the
vai ser uma
country.
onda de desemprego, como se
It's going to create
falava na
unemployment.
Europa, desertificação.
We could all, and then
essas-
there's
ao
the
redor
problem,
dessas
like
indústrias vivem
Europeans that don't
comunidades.
always take Brazilian exports because of their
Já tem
own
o problema dos
certification
migrantes que eu fiz
process.
referência.
So we have this
E
immigration
nenhum país
issue,
do
obviously.
continente mais progressista que seja o seu governo tem condições de enfrentar o império.
So even progressive
questão é,
countries here in
por
Latin
que que o
America have a
Lula,
hard time
a Cláudia Sheinbaum,
confronting
o
the
Petro,
U.S. empire
mesmo
around
Maduro,
issues like
não
migration.
toma uma iniciativa em escala
No.
continental
You know, why doesn't Lula lead an initiative
para fazer
across
frente
Latin
ao
America to
império, ao
try to
imperialismo?
confront the
Essa é outra
empire, confront
atitude
Trump on his
seria vista
immigration policies
pela
and how it's
população de
impacting
maneira
their Latin
larga.
America? You
Não
know,
ia
these are
provocar
things that
o
Lula could do.
humor
Right?
das classes dominantes nem dos militares,
You know, we
Mas
can't
uma
wait
medida de
for the
soberania.
dominant classes for the military
Nos
to
nossos
just
países,
automatically support us, right?
pouco diferentemente dos Estados
You
Unidos.
know, this is
A
it's
soberania
different
aqui
than
é
the United States.
considerada como um elemento de afirmação popular, né? Então, para ser breve,
So again, you
ele
know, we want to take
sinalizaria
advantage of this
caminhos
important moment that we
para a gente
have, you
chegar
know,
em
popular
26,
acceptance for reforms to actually make
daqui
the
um ano e
reforms.
meio, nas eleições
You know, we still have
presidenciais,
we still have a
melhores
year and a
condições
half
que nós estamos
before the
hoje.
next elections are held, so we need to really work on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Cruz. Thank you, Fanny, all for your contributions here. We are at time, but it looks like we are basically combining different perspectives towards some synthesis here about the need for us as socialists to get out of our comfort zones and find new partners, more people to engage with, to present our vision, and to convince them that it's viable, not just viable, but necessary for the challenges that are ahead, that are economic, political, societal, and whether that goes to directly to people door to door, in the streets, but also that people are craving leadership, and it's not going to come from the center. And it's got to come from us in all forms of society, whether it's in political institutions or in the streets, and or in a geopolitical sense, as we're crying for more leadership against the daily crimes committed by the Israeli regime and genocide in Gaza. So the work continues, and hopefully we can continue to keep in touch with our comrades from across the world as we continue to work on against our shared enemies. And in that sense, one area that they are trying to beat us in, especially, is in the area of LGBTQ and trans rights. That is why our next public-facing meeting for SMC will be in April on trans liberation. keep in touch, look into your inboxes for the invites for that when they come. And until then, thank you all for joining us this evening and enjoy the rest of your weekends.
Bye bye.